What's up, Defenders? Welcome to the channel. This is the first episode that we're putting out of an 8-video series. We're going to put out one every single week, and we're going to go through 8 arguments for the existence of God. All of the arguments are constructed in the same basic way. God is the best explanation of blank. So I recently, in the Private Defenders Academy platform, which there's links to in the description, posted an image that showcased 8 arguments that God is the best explanation of blank, all 8 of these arguments. And I asked, just, respond if you would like to see a video explaining how each of these arguments goes. And, well, it actually got some pretty good response. So here we are making those videos. Check it out. Here we go. The first one we're going to talk about is God as the best explanation for why something exists rather than nothing, why anything exists at all. This is a very famous old argument, so let's go ahead and dig right into it. The first question, which should rightly be asked, is why is there something rather than nothing? This is from Leibniz. This is the famous Leibnizian Cosmological argument. And for those of you who don't know who Leibniz was, he wasn't only a philosopher, he was also a mathematician. He co-discovered calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton. They discovered it independently. So he was an absolute brilliant mind, and he constructed this argument that we're going through today. So, the Leibnizian cosmological argument goes as follows. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And premise 3, the universe exists. That is the entire argument. What follows are the logical conclusions from these premises. So a properly constructed logical argument is one where you have a set of premises, and if assumed true, the conclusions follow by necessity. Now, you might look at these premises and have an issue with one or two or maybe all 3 of them. That's okay right now. I want you to follow the logic, assuming they are true. So, if these are all true, then what follows? Conclusion 1, we get the universe has an explanation of existence from 1 and 3. 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, and 3, the universe exists. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. This follows by logical necessity if both premises are true. And then conclusion number 2. Therefore, the explanation of the universe is God, from premise 2 and conclusion 1. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Conclusion 1, therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. We can see that when these two are put together, they follow a very standard logical structure. It's the same logical structure as the structure of P implies Q, P therefore Q. This is the same thing as if we were to try to think of a very popular, famous, ancient example, we could go with the example that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It follows the same logical structure as those. So these are the 2 conclusions that follow if these 3 premises are true. So now let's start having a conversation about these premises. And the way that I'd like to talk about it today is looking at the premises themselves, looking at objections to the premises, and then talking through the evidence for the premises. If the premises are more likely true than not, then the conclusions follow by logical necessity. So let's look at premise 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. So you could object to this, and you could say, God must have an explanation of his existence because that's what this premise means. You're absolutely right. Actually, I agree with you. It's true. Everything that exists must have an explanation of its existence. This explanation, however, is either the necessity of its own nature or else it is some other cause outside of it. This is exactly what Leibniz would have said. Everything that begins to exist has an Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in its own necessity or from some external cause. So, there are, according to Leibniz, there are 2 different types of beings that we can think about. We can think about necessary beings. These are beings that exist of their own nature and so have no external cause. These are beings that must exist necessarily. And 2, contingent beings. These are beings that's existence is accounted for by causal factors outside of themselves. Now, you might look at this and say, that sounds like it's begging the question, because there is no necessary being besides the traditional monotheistic version of God. But most mathematicians actually disagree with you. As somebody who majored in mathematics and then went on to teach mathematics for several years, and then also took several master's courses on mathematics, I beg to differ. I think there are other things other than God that exist necessarily, mainly abstract objects like numbers and multiplication symbols and functions. These things don't have any physical space that they occupy. They're not temporal. They're not functioned by time. They're not restricted by time, but they exist. I would argue they exist necessarily. I would also argue that the laws of logic exist necessarily. So there are things besides God that seem to exist necessarily. So beings either exist necessarily by the nature of their own being, or they are contingent beings which exist because of causal factors outside of themselves. So, first objection, God must have an explanation of existence. I agree. God must have an explanation of his existence. Leibniz would agree. His argument would be that God's explanation of his existence is in his own nature. He is a necessary being. So objection 2 might argue that this is only true of everything in the universe, but it's not true of the universe itself. And without ample reasoning to argue this, without defense, this is actually a very common, popular argument to rebuke cosmological arguments like this one, is to say that that is true of everything in the universe, but it's not true of the universe. And they might even argue that we're using the fallacy of composition by assuming that it is true of the universe. But the reality is, all of our evidence, all of our empirical evidence, all of our experiential evidence, all of our logical evidence says there's this thing called the law of causality, that things have to have a cause if they have a beginning. And so, without ample reasoning to argue that the universe is an exception, this is just a textbook example of special pleading. Special pleading is where you say that one specific thing is the exception to the rule without explaining why. So, when somebody actually poses this objection that this is true of everything in the universe but not of the universe, they actually are taking on the mantle of burden of proof. They must explain and defend why it's not true of the universe. So objection 3 often looks like this. It is impossible for the universe to have an explanation. Now, the explanation of the universe, this is the objection, the explanation of the universe would have to exist logically prior to the universe. But prior to the existence of the universe, there was nothing, and nothing can't be the cause of something. So the universe must exist inexplicably. Okay, here's how we would respond to an argument like this. First and foremost, this is question begging. When somebody says this, the only reason that they're making this argument at all is because they presupposed that there is no God. They said there's nothing outside of the universe. What if that's not true? See, they're building in this concept that there is nothing outside the universe, that there is nothing metaphysical, that there is no possibility of God. And if that's true, if it's true that there's no God, then nothing exists outside the universe. And then, if we give them that idea that nothing exists outside the universe, then they would be right. Nothing can't cause something. Out of nothing, nothing comes. They're right. So the universe must exist inexplicably. But it actually seems far more reasonable that that initial premise, that assumption that there's nothing outside the universe must be wrong. There must be something outside the universe because the law of causality says that anything that began to exist has a cause. That's actually a different argument I'm going to get to in a couple weeks, but in the wording there. But the point stands that there is no good reason to believe that nothing exists outside of the universe. And if the atheist is going to argue that nothing exists outside the universe, they again have burden of proof in order to defend their conclusion that the universe exists inexplicably. Furthermore, there's actually logical and empirical evidence to show that there was a start to the universe. We have good reason now, and I'm going to also dig into this even deeper in a couple weeks. We have really good reason to believe that the universe began to exist 13.7 billion years ago. If that's true that the universe began to exist 13.7 billion years ago, then it follows that something caused it. The argument that the universe exists inexplicably needs to state that the universe was past eternal, but it's not. So they are now fighting this argument of the universe popped into being inexplicably out of nothing, even though nothing can't be the cause of anything, a finite time ago. You see this objection just doesn't hold water. It isn't even coherent. So let's go ahead and move on from arguments on the first premise. The first premise, even when you first read it, you probably looked at it and said, this isn't really the premise that I have an issue with. It seems to be self-intuitive that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. The sticky one was actually premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. This, on its surface, looks like question begging. It looks like we presupposed God as the answer. But we actually didn't. One of the objections that we saw to premise 1 could be constructed in this way. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. That was kind of the last objection we looked at. Now, in order for me to explain where premise 2 came from, I'm going to need to teach you a little bit about fundamental logic. Okay, because maybe you see it already, the connection between objection 1 and premise 2 here. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence, and if the universe has an explanation of existence, that explanation is God. Maybe you can see that connection. Think about it. Okay, because here's how I would respond to this objection that says, or here's the explanation on how this isn't question begging, rather. So what you have in front of you is something called a truth table. A truth table is what we use in logic to see if something is logically equivalent to another form, to see the possibilities. So P and Q are both assertions. You can think of them as assertions. We can say that P could say, let's say that P is atheism is true. And let's say that Q is that there's no explanation of the universe. Okay? So it's either case that those are both true. It's the case that P is true and Q is false. It's the case that P is false and Q is true, or it's the case that both are false. Okay? From there, we can then look at the logical structure of arguments. P implies Q is objection 1 here. P implies Q. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. So, P implies Q if and only if every time that P is true, Q is true. Okay, so P has to be true, and then Q has to be true. It doesn't matter if P is false. If P is false, then it's only the case that if we have an if and only if relationship that Q would necessarily have to be false. So, when P is true and Q is true, P implies true, Q is true. When P is true and Q is false, P implies Q is false. When P is false, we automatically say that P implies Q is true. We don't care about Q anymore. Okay? The converse of an argument is where you flip the two propositions. You flip P and Q. So does Q imply P? That works if Q is true and P is true, or if Q is false. So, does Q imply P? Q to P? Yes. Q doesn't matter. Q to P? No. Q doesn't matter. So true, true, false, true. The inverse is where you simply negate both of them. So you can think of that as putting a not in it. If atheism is not true, that would be the negation of P. So the inverse is where you negate both. You say not P implies not Q. And there we go. The contrapositive is where you negate both and you switch their spots. So we negate them both and then we switch their spots to put Q on the left. Not Q implies not P. Now, in logic, the reason that truth tables matter, they're a lot of work to construct, so we don't usually construct them if we don't have to. The reason that they matter is that they show us when two statements are logically equivalent to each other. You'll notice that the original statement, P implies Q, is logically equivalent to the contrapositive. They both have the structure of true, false, true, true. That means that these two statements are logically equivalent to each other. They're saying the same thing. Now, the objection statement is, if atheism is true, then the universe has no explanation of its existence. The inverse of that would be, if atheism is not true, negating it, then the universe has an explanation of its existence, negating it. And then the contrapositive is going to be to take those two and switch their roles. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. Okay. So the objection, if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence, is logically equivalent to the statement, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. Here, let me clear the screen a little bit and let's look at this a little simply. Okay, objection 1. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. The contrapositive. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. Or you could say that differently. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God. So, it turns out, far from being question-begging, premise 2 is actually just agreeing with what the atheist already said. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. We agreed, and that's how we got premise 2 constructed. We took the contrapositive of your statement. So, we agree. That's nuts, isn't it? Okay. So, what's another objection that we might see to premise 2? That the universe exists necessarily. So we might be going back against all of our objections to premise 1, and where premise 1 said that everything that begins to exist has an explanation. Premise 1 said everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. And then we said that that explanation is either that it exists necessarily, or the explanation is a cause that's outside of itself. So, the atheist can simply say that the universe exists necessarily. Response to that might look like, well, really, honestly, that just isn't what the data shows, unfortunately. Now, we could argue about the issues of logic. We could point out how the universe existed a finite time ago, and things that have a temporal beginning don't exist necessarily. Or we could talk about superstring theory, the most promising theory of everything that we currently have. Within superstring theory, there are no less than 10 to the 500 different types of universe that would have been logically possible and consistent with all of our current laws of nature based on the different possible values of the quantities like the gravitational constant and the Hubble constant, the expansion rate of the universe. And we get that in the 5 Arguments for God by William Lane Craig. It's on page 26. We simply know that there are 10 to the 500 different universes that could have existed. There's nothing about anything that we know within physics today that suggests that anything about this universe is necessary. The fact that it began to exist within a finite time in the past points to the idea that it's not necessary, and then the fact that we could have different universes that would have held to all of our laws of nature shows that this universe is not necessary. Okay, what about objections to premise 3? The universe exists. Now, this might seem like I'm just having fun, but actually there are people who argue against premise 3. They would argue from different forms of skepticism. These are forms that are saying things like, well, you can't prove to me that I'm not a brain in a vat. You can't prove to me that there aren't an infinite number of universes. You can't prove to me that I'm not inside the matrix. I don't need to. Skepticism, while a near universally rejected stance with no benefit to thought or discussion, as it is not possible to bring understanding forward within skepticism, it isn't actually able to avoid this premise. See, the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," is an argument against skepticism. You could say, you can't prove to me that I'm not a brain in a vat. You're right, I can't. However, if you're a brain in a vat, you're a brain in a vat inside a universe. If you're in a matrix, you're in a matrix inside a universe. If your conscious mind is the only conscious mind that exists in a reality where it has fabricated everything that you interact with, that is still the universe. So, at no point do we get away from premise 3, the universe exists, and very few people ever try to anyway. So, what we've done is we've shown that all 3 of these premises are really strong. They're more likely true than not. So what's our conclusion? Everything that exists has an explanation of its cause, of its existence, either in its own necessity or in an external cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. This we got from the contrapositive of the atheist statement that the universe has no explanation of its existence, if atheism is true. 3, the universe exists. We've defended all of these as relatively strong and right to believe arguments, our premises. So now, the conclusions follow by necessity. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. That follows from 1 and 3. And therefore, the explanation of the universe is God. From 2 and conclusion 1. You can see that the Leibnizian argument is actually incredibly strong, very robust. That's what I have for you guys. Next week, we're going to talk about the next one on our list. See you then. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching that video. Hey, since you stuck all the way until the end, that tells me that you actually have an interest in what we're doing. So at the Defenders Academy, we exist to show people the evidence for our faith, to explain to people that all the scientific reasoning, all the logical reasoning, all the historical evidence supports Christianity, and that there is no other worldview that's as well supported. So we are here to help people build a strong foundation for their beliefs, and hopefully to help spread the gospel as far and wide as the Lord allows. If that's something that you're interested in, if you like our vision, if you like our mission, then I'd invite you to prayerfully consider supporting us. We just set up a Patreon, and if you would like to support us financially so that we can continue doing this is my full-time endeavor. I have a wife, and eventually we're going to need to be able to actually pay bills. So if you're interested in helping us do that and you want to support us financially, I would invite you to prayerfully consider becoming a patron for us on Patreon. I love you guys. See you next video.